A group of South African academics believe that global intellectual property rights should not apply to COVID-19 medicines. Last month, some academics and researchers expressed their support on the position taken by South Africa and India at the World Trade Organization in relation to the intellectual property agreement as far as COVID-19 treatment is concerned. Now, the group has called on President Cyril Ramaphosa to provide an urgent response to their concerns. To unpack this further, I'm joined by Lebohang Pheko, a senior research fellow at Trade Collective. Very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. As we speak, just yesterday, the World Health Organization hailed this rapid response towards a COVID-19 vaccine, insisting that every country must reap the benefits. But before we even get to reaping those benefits, there are a number of challenges. Let's talk about those.
So, I think the key challenge is that, and it's been what has been enunciated by South Africa and India, is that we really need to think around a world that has not yet reached COVID immunity and make the assumption that everybody is susceptible to it. The argument is that a lot of the waivers that are available right now under the TRIPS at the WTO, which is the intellectual property clause, do not allow for competition, and they do not allow for single licensing of any goods. So in other words, they encourage monopolies, pharmaceutical monopolies, what I would call pharmaceutical colonialism, which means that they can set their own costs, set their own prices, and make this inaccessible. The argument has been that any medicine should be made a public good, particularly because this is a public health crisis, an international emergency. And of course, there's a precedent to this. The precedent being the sterling work that South Africa did in the late 90s and early 2000s around HIV treatment and access to ARVs, which used to be prohibitively expensive at a time when the pandemic, the HIV pandemic, which was one of the first major pandemics long before Corona, to hit this country and to hit the world. So we need to think around access to health and the right to life. There's an ethical, a legal, as well as a moral obligation in this situation.
You mentioned very briefly the HIV/AIDS situation as well as ARV treatment, that we have been here before. What are the stark differences between now and then?
I don't think there really are any. I think that what the stark difference between now and then is that this time we know much less about the ways in which this particular pandemic is going to play itself out. We also understand a lot less about its resistance, the way that it reacts to different people react to it, and that there's much less medical research. This is why there has been a very little bandwidth by the establishment to entertain multiple ways, perhaps, of exploring different remedies and different pathways to a cure. So, the Madagascans have their own cure, the Tanzanians, and so on. So not only is it about a pathway to a cure, it's also a contestation of an ideology, right? So the difference between mainstream, conventional, some would say Western, but I would just say, mainstream medicine and alternatives. The other thing that's quite problematic in this regard is that the safety and the efficacy of the COVID virus and the COVID drug have not yet been proven. And there are huge concerns for many bioethicists that, of course, yet again, countries of the global south potentially are being treated like guinea pigs, like human guinea pigs, basically. And I think South Africa, Thailand, if I'm not mistaken, Brazil, and a few other countries, all of them in the global south, were the ones which were earmarked for these vaccinations or for these trials, for these vaccine trials, which I think is quite problematic. And I think given the history that there is with pharmaceuticals, big pharma, in Black communities and in the global south, that suspicion is probably not invalid. And finally, Pfizer, of course, is a company, historically, massive issues, of course, not only in this country, but globally, with their way of monopolizing and exploiting indigenous communities, particularly the Khoisan community in this country, of their own traditional, I don't even want to say traditional because that sounds very fetishist, but of their own community cures, of their own historical repository of knowledge. Yeah. And I think that, for all of these reasons, there are huge problems and very huge challenges with this, which perhaps in the instance of HIV/AIDS were not as prominent.
Let's talk about these dangers of big pharmaceutical companies coming in here to profit as a result of a situation that really is, this one here is a critical one. It's a matter of life and death. Profit versus health. What are the huge challenges there that really need to be ironed out? I mean, you speak about people being used as guinea pigs in impoverished communities and indigenous medicines being taken for granted.
Look, there are a few things, Mpho. When we remove intellectual property on COVID-19 medical tools, we potentially take back control and power from pharmaceutical corporations. And what this means is then we can potentially avoid the tragedy, repeating the tragedy of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where monopolies on life-saving treatment saw people in high-income countries grossly gaining access to life-saving ARVs at the expense of developing countries or countries in the global south. I think the second, despite the existence, by the way, of affordable HIV treatment at the time, and I think the sad thing is that it's not a case of everybody is in the dark and that there's nobody who has an advantage. Developing countries, or developed countries, I should say Western countries, because they're not really developed, they're just former colonizers, and I think including in medical colonialism, right? So they have often got these access to these cures at hand, waiting for a time that they will be able to profit and maximize them. And remember that intellectual property is not only in medicine, it includes designs, it includes trade secrets. So knowledge in this regard becomes a great commodity, right? So knowing and not knowing becomes the great secret, which is why in the past there have been campaigns in this country, the Right to Know campaign, which is a campaign which has been running for many years, for which I think many of us have great respect, and so forth. The right to know, the right to see, the right to understand what kind of undertakings our states our states are actually taking. Well, I think that the overriding monopolies on COVID-19 drugs and tools and equipment, they will probably allow global collaboration on manufacturing and scale up. And when we're not thinking about the profit imperatives and what Dis-Chem is going to make and what pharmaceuticals are going to make, then it becomes much more compassionate. And it also means that life-saving medical tools, which is sold at cost and not at huge profit, can then begin to deal with this life issue, this moral and ethical dilemma that we're living in. Many things, many diseases, if we remember that disease is an industry, it then takes away the perspective that we're all desperately blind people who are moving in a sea of illness and darkness, and rather think around it as a way of pharmaceuticals continuing to override their power, even over sovereign states, which is very problematic, because states also have an obligation to provide healthcare, public healthcare. We see healthcare as a public good, not something that people need to have access to only if they have, particular medical aid.
As you speak about the role of the state, you've also voiced your concerns with President Cyril Ramaphosa. What are you hoping to get out of that? I mean, I know, there have been calls for an urgent response to the concerns by a group of South African academics who are talking about how this matter is really important, and that intellectual property waiver and the concerns that come with it sets a dangerous precedent for the country receiving this vaccine. What response should government be giving in this matter?
For the record, I don't think I raised any concerns with President Ramaphosa in this conversation with you.
It was a group of South African academics, pardon me, who raised these concerns.
Okay. So basically, I think that what's quite important is in this instance is that governments have to have the chance to back this proposal and put public health and people's lives over business interests instead of pharmaceutical corporations. We also have the opportunity to decide or not decide whether or not we want to be part of the human zoo, part of the human guinea pig industry in this country. We can also evoke particular TRIPS, trade intellectual property agreement flexibilities, which do promote access, and various WTO members have faced challenges in this regard in using them promptly and use them effectively. And this is where our own national sovereignty space and national policy sovereignty comes into play quite importantly. So often compulsory licenses are on a product by product basis and a country by country basis. If we say that as a country, we feel that this pandemic is hampering our national growth, our interests, it's a public health crisis. We're not able to deal with it. Our hospitals are going to be overwhelmed, which I think any country right now could make a compelling argument for. We should certainly use and evoke that. And I think that where IP barriers are beyond patents, they're beyond national legislation, national laws. Countries which don't have sufficient manufacturing capacity should then be able to deal with expediting solutions in different ways by evoking this as a public health emergency. And I think that lastly to say that until and unless concrete steps are taken at global level to really deal with the intellectual property inequalities, right, and technology barriers, all of these shortcomings are going to keep playing themselves as new medication, new medical procedures, new public health crisis, new intellectual crisis come to mind as we grow as states. And I think also it then also brings into question yet again the role of the World Trade Organization and the power relations that play themselves out at the World Trade Organization. For many years, quite a few of us for 15 or 20 years have been saying that the World Trade Organization in and of itself is not steeped in favor of developing countries. It favors the interests of big pharma and often privileges big pharma over national states. So South Africa has done an excellent thing by taking leadership in this regard with India to call for this waiver. I think that at a time when there's so much darkness and despair globally, this is actually a glimmer of really great resistance and a sense of taking national authority over these circumstances and over pharmaceutical companies.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. That was Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko, giving us a sense there of what this intellectual waiver means. The intellectual property rights should not apply to COVID-19 medicines. That's according to a group of South African academics who are of that view.